Israel does not have the world's biggest army, but it is the most effective. Think about it, we are talking about a country with less than 9 million inhabitants. Nonetheless, they have won wars against countries 10 times bigger. For example, during the 6 Days War, Israel confronted a coalition that included Egypt, Syria, and Jordan. All of these countries put together summed up to more than 130 million people, and they sent over 240,000 soldiers, twice as many as the Israeli army did. In other words, no one would expect a victory for Israel, but history was rather different. In just 6 days, the Israeli Defense Forces, also known as IDF, wiped out their enemies. And yes, I know what you're going to say now. The Israelis have the best technology and weaponry, right? Well, that is true now, but it wasn't back then. For instance, in 1973, during the Yom Kippur War, Israel's weapons were as modern as those of their main rival, Syria. In fact, the IDF had some combat jets manufactured in the 1950s, the famous A4 Skyhawk. However, the Syrians, they had state-of-the-art anti-aircraft missiles. They were given to the Soviets just 5 years before, and who won that war? Yeah, it was Israel. Alright, so I can hear some of you saying now, oh come on Simon, but Israel has the support of America. That's a really big help. And yes, at this point you are right. Israel is the country that receives the most help from Uncle Sam. But do you know of any other country who buys the best weaponry from America? Well, that would be Saudi Arabia. The Saudis have an army as big and as modern as the Israeli one. But if you've been subscribed to Visual Politic for a while, you already know that the big failure of the Saudi army was fighting guerrilla warriors, namely those Houthi rebels from Yemen. In other words, neither the technology nor the American support are enough to explain why the Israeli army is such a fearful one. So, the question of the day is, why is the Israeli army so powerful? What are the key elements explaining such military success? Well, today we are going to tell you the 5 key facts that explain this.
Fast decision making.
Every army is based on hierarchy and authority, right? Well, some of them, they're more flexible than others. In this other video, we explained how the Saudi army has a bigger sense of hierarchy, and the officials don't have much power to make their own decisions. The same goes with other Arabic countries like Syria or Egypt. So here is an example. Imagine a Syrian unit defending a position. Let's say their headquarters have been destroyed before the soldiers in the front line are aware of it. If they have to follow the normal procedure, they will have to wait until someone gives them an order. During this time, they don't know if they should retreat, strike back, or coordinate with other military units. Alright, so now you might be wondering, well, why are Arab armies so centralized? Now, don't forget that most of these countries are dictatorships or absolute monarchies. If you are a tyrant, you want your army to be under control in order to micromanage every little decision in order to prevent a coup d'etat. The Israeli army is way different from that. Let's look back to our previous example. In this case, the Israeli commander on the front line wouldn't need to wait for orders. He has a degree of his own decision-making power, so he can react immediately and seize opportunities.
In fact, this is pretty normal in almost all Western armies. The big planning is centralized, but the execution is decentralized. This way, the organization is more flexible and can react more quickly.
But unlike the Western countries, Israel has something unique in their culture. We are talking about a pretty unknown fact about this country, yet it is a very, very important one. Israel is the least hierarchical country on the planet, and you can feel this in every aspect of their culture. Inside of an Israeli company, it's pretty normal for an average worker to have a discussion with his boss. Debates are a common thing, and there is a pretty small sense of authority. Actually, in the 1970s, a Dutch anthropologist named Geert Hofstede studied the power relationships in different countries. Over the course of 6 years, he surveyed IBM workers in different offices around the globe. This is how the Power Distance Index was born. And among all those countries, Israel has the lowest power distance, while the Arab countries like Egypt or Saudi Arabia rank among the highest. In other words, Israeli citizens are educated in flexibility more than any other nation.
Internal cohesion.
In Israel, military service is mandatory for every citizen, regardless of their social condition or their gender. Both men and women, rich and poor, start from the very bottom. Well, actually, this is not entirely true because the ultra-Orthodox Jews don't need to do military service, and neither does Israel's Palestinian population. But the rest of Israel's citizens must serve in the military and fall into a meritocratic scheme. This means everyone must follow the same rules in order to be promoted. And this is not as common as you might think. For instance, during World War II, the aristocrats who joined the British Army started with higher positions than the peasants and the working class. And of course, such elitism, it tends to destroy an army's morale and make it harder for it to function. For example, the Saudi army consists of both civil servants and members of the royal family. And hierarchy matters a lot. The son of a Saudi prince will never be a soldier, and as you can imagine, this classist structure has negative consequences.
Combat morale.
In the year 1973, Israel fought the Egyptian and the Syrian army at the same time. As we said at the beginning, back then Israel was not the technological powerhouse that it is today. Syrians had those anti-aircraft guns, the S-200s that we mentioned before, and during the first days, those anti-aircraft missiles destroyed a lot of Israeli combat jets. Israel, they had to retreat. Nonetheless, Uncle Sam was here to help. The White House sent a package of weapons so they could neutralize the S-200s and the radars, things like flares that could confuse the smart missiles that were guided by temperature. This way, the Israelis struck back, and in a short amount of time they finished off the Syrian defenses. And, well, guess what happened next? Well, a lot of those Arab soldiers, scared of being wiped out from the air, well, they defected. If you look at the picture on the screen, you will see 7 Syrian tanks. They are not moving, but not one of them is destroyed. Well, it means that the soldiers that were inside of those tanks, they decided to run away. Defection is a common problem when morale is low, and this is a common problem for Arab armies.
20 Syrian troops defect to southern Turkish province of Hatay.
Think about it. If you are an Israeli soldier or an American one, you know you must be loyal to your country. But Arab soldiers have too many ethnic, national, and religious identities. Imagine you are a Syrian soldier and at the same time you are a Kurd or you belong to the Muslim Brotherhood. Both groups are chased by the Syrian government, so, well, who are you loyal to? Of course, the army pays your bills, but when your life is at risk and everything is lost, what's more important? Your salary or your life? In other words, no matter your wealth and your technology, if your soldiers are not strongly motivated, you've already lost. And the Israelis, they know that better than anyone.
Human capital.
All tanks place their engines on the back side. But why is this? Because usually the rockets hit on the front side and you want your tank to keep working even after being hit. This is why all the models, from the German Leopards to the Russian T-90s, keep their engines in the back. Nonetheless, the Israeli army doesn't value the vehicle as much as their soldiers. This is why the Israeli Merkava is the only one of its kind that has the engines in the front. This way, a rocket will destroy the tank, but it will protect the soldiers. Putting aside the ethics, Israel has a really small population. This means that they can't allow themselves to lose too many soldiers. This is why they receive much more intense training with real bullets and better equipment. And don't forget that this is the country where Krav Maga, one of the most advanced martial arts, was born. You can also see this human capital doctrine reflected in their intelligence service, the Mossad. It is considered one of the best in the entire world. And if one day you happen to travel to Israel, you should know that they will take your phone number and other data because they know information is power. But alright, I know what you want to hear now. You came to this video because you wanted to hear about state-of-the-art weaponry, right? Well, here you have it.
Made in Israel.
During the 1980s, the Israeli government wanted a secret weapon, a weapon no one had ever heard of until recently. So they met a local manufacturer, a company called Raphael, to design a very special vehicle, the so-called Pera. This is a vehicle that looks like a tank, but in fact is a tank hunter weapon with a big rocket launcher. If you know about weapons, you know there's a big difference. Tank weaponry has to reach a distance of between 2 and 4 kilometers. Pero rockets can travel a distance of 30. So imagine the situation. The enemies would take satellite pictures to see the Israeli weaponry, and they would see a lot of normal tanks. Based on this, they would plan their strategy, but then, surprise, surprise, those tanks are not tanks, but in fact something with a much, much bigger reach. For decades, this Para was one of the most mysterious weapons of the Israeli army, and their main strength was that no one knew anything about them. So now the question is, how come Israel makes its own secret weapons and other countries don't? Well, the answer is that in Israel there are a lot of rocket science companies that give it a world-class defense industry. So a while ago we did a video about Israeli startups. Well, in the 1980s the Israeli government created a special program which was called Yozma. This program consisted of 10 hedge funds with both private and government money in them. Those funds helped to create a lot of tech companies. And you know what the favorite industry for those brand new startups was? Well, of course, it was the military industry. At the end of the day, the army, it was a rich and reliable client.
All of a sudden, dozens of weapon manufacturers were born. Companies that created customized products that met the exact needs of the Israeli army at every moment. From the Iron Dome defense system to the Merkava tanks or the Pare we mentioned before.
So now you might be wondering what happens in the other countries. Well, let's first consider Saudi Arabia. As you know, the Saudi economy has got a problem. It relies heavily on the oil industry. Of course, thanks to the dinosaur juice, the Saudis have become rich and they can pay for the third biggest army in the world, only surpassed by China and America. But expensive is not a synonym for good. The Saudi army buys their tanks from the USA, and those are customized for the needs of the American army. Besides, that makes it harder to have a secret weapon because everyone knows what you bought on the international market.